All right, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Christopher Lloyd Tucker, and I'm a local artist. And I'm here today because Dr. Denise Rogers has invited me to be part of the Echoes of Africa exhibition at the Downtown Library that's happening this summer. It's going to open in June. And it's going to feature the work from the World Cultures Collection, which is here at Mesa College, as well as the work of a handful of local artists. And I'm very happy to be included in that. That's fantastic. So I'm thinking that I'm going to show you a little bit of my previous work. I'm going to show you some of my current work. This is part of my current body of work here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I make these. And then I'm going to tell you about a residency that I just did. That's something that I had never done before. Artists from time to time do residencies at various art centers, galleries, things like that, where they just give you a space and some time to just make something new. Okay, so I'll just get started. I come from Chicago originally, and when I first started making art, I basically just copied comic books. I was big into comic books, and I just would draw from them and then learned how to draw, pencil and paper kind of stuff. And over time, I ended up making my own comic books and stories and getting a little bit more abstract with it. Eventually, I ended up going to an arts high school, which ended up being really good for me because it was a great community of artists. I learned a lot about fine arts and art history, and I was able to get out of the comic books a little bit and get into something a little bit larger than that. And it was especially nice because there was a great community there, not just visual artists, but musicians, people in the theater, dancers. I ended up seeing more live performances in high school than I could ever afford to see at any other time in my life. So that was really quite nice to be able to do. So I ended up making a lot of different kinds of work, got out of pencil and paper a little bit. I learned a little bit of printmaking, a little bit of painting, but it was all pretty much 2D work. There was a little bit of sculpture, but not too much. And I really liked sculpture. So once I left school, I ended up going to various art centers and park districts around Chicago to kind of build up a sculptural practice. So I went to a metal shop, and that worked out really well for me. I just thought welding seemed cool, so I would try it, and I did, and it is cool. So I learned some welding, I learned some blacksmithing, and I stayed there long enough that I ended up being a shop tech at that place. So these two, let me use this laser pointer. So this is welded and blacksmithed, and this is as well, and this has some fabric aspects to it. And the piece at the end was just a log that I found in the neighborhood. I went to the store, I bought a hammer and chisel, and I started carving at it because I wanted to learn some stuff. I didn't see a class for it, so I just tried it. Worked out fine. This is some more metal smithing that I did. I ended up staying there for a number of years, I think maybe 4 years, so I made a lot of work there. And it was really nice because as difficult as metal seems, it actually can work very, very quickly. So you could make small sculptures in just a couple of hours. This here is a guitar. I didn't build the guitar, it was just something that I found lying around. But I took some of the skills that I learned in printmaking and I just carved into it. So the surface, the darker parts are the patina that was on the guitar originally. And I just took a small wood carving tool and carved into it to make little designs, exposing the natural wood underneath it. So I made a bunch of tables and stuff like that with this kind of technique. And every now and then I would just completely run out of money and I would go to the fabric store because fabric is cheap, and I would buy a lot of fabric and I would make stuffed animals. My mother taught me how to sew, and she let me use her sewing machine. And I just made a bunch of weird things. I ended up making an octopus that was about 9 feet tall, and I would hang it over my bed. And I made a weird caterpillar and stuff. So that was kind of nice. But then when I did have a little bit of money, I ended up making larger sculpture and furniture. So this is a coffee table that I made. It has a little bit of woodworking that I learned in Chicago, and a little bit of metalworking as well, a lot of sharp corners. And I really liked doing this kind of work, but it ended up being problematic because if you do enough of this, you just run out of space. It's very hard to make a lot of sculpture unless you're selling it or you have some kind of storage facility. I did not have a storage facility and I was not selling it. So I ended up having to switch, and I started making jewelry. I was able to use a lot of the same skills from blacksmithing in silversmithing. So I was able to do this because during the 1930s, we were in the Depression. And the federal government put out a bunch of different programs to try and get people out of the Depression, give them some skills to work on. And in Chicago in particular, they just went to all of the park districts in the city and gave them the funds to put together wood shops and metal shops and jewelry shops, something that would just give people brand new skill sets that they could then go out and earn money with. So I was able to learn woodworking for like $30 for like a 6-month term, and jewelry making for like exactly that same price. It was just incredibly cheap to go there and learn. So I ended up doing jewelry making for a number of years, eventually got a job with the guy who was teaching the class, and he ended up teaching me a whole bunch of other stuff. So I was a jeweler's assistant for many years. At some point he started remodeling his house, so I helped him out with that. I learned a bunch of just basic construction and hand tools and stuff like that. Which has always been helpful for me. And eventually I ended up getting a job at a different community center teaching these jewelry making skills that I had just learned. But at some point I ended up having to go back to school. All of the work that I was doing at that point was sculptural. It took a lot of materials, it took a lot of time, and I ended up going back to school to study animation because it just looked like a lot of work was being done digitally, and I wanted to get involved in that. So I went back to school, started doing some just regular pen and paper drawing again, just like I did when I was a kid. A little bit of digital drawing as well, but then I mostly got into 3D animation. I really liked that, just building 3D models. So I did that for a couple of years, and while I was doing that, I ended up getting a couple of other skills. I did some web design, I did some graphic design, that kind of thing. So I ended up working freelance for a good couple of years, doing a little bit of that kind of stuff. Little web design, little graphic design, very little actual 3D animation, which is what I mostly wanted to do, but there just wasn't that much work for somebody at my skill level in Chicago at the time. But I would get involved with a couple of like startup projects that like we would build a little thing and it didn't really go anywhere, but you know, that's just how it goes with that kind of work. But at some point, right around there, my wife got a job in San Diego. So we decided to pack up all our stuff, leave winter behind forever, and move to California, which was a really nice deal. I thought I was going to do a lot better in California on account of the 3D modeling and 3D animation. But I just didn't realize how much smaller San Diego was than Chicago. Every time I saw a job that looked good, step one was move to LA, every single time. So I ended up kind of giving up on that after a while and just doing other stuff. I drove an Uber for a while, which actually is quite a good job if you move to a brand new city, because you don't need to know your way around. GPS will take care of that. And you get to know your way around by driving around the city a little bit, and everybody who gets in your car wants to tell you something great about the city. So that was nice. Got a lot of good advice there. And I did that for a while until I found a 3D printing shop that wanted to give me a job. I had heard about 3D printing, I had seen it on the internet, I had never done it before, but I had a couple of skill sets that were interesting to them. I had the 3D modeling, which is how you end up making 3D prints in the first place. But I also had a long career in making jewelry. And that is a lot of small, intricate work, a lot of filing and sanding and stuff like that. And you actually need that for 3D printing. I didn't realize this at the time, but when you print something, it doesn't come out all clean and precise or anything like that. There's a lot of cutting and sanding and polishing it up afterwards. So this little robot here is the first thing I 3D printed. I made this model and I just brought it over to the shop. And one day when there just was not a ton of work to be done, we made it in the shop there. And I really liked it. It was just a cute little robot. And one day, it fell off the shelf and its leg broke. And I was thinking, well, that's no big deal. I'll just print myself a new one. I've already got the file and everything. But then I changed my mind and I instead printed it a cast and a pair of crutches. So then it was a robot with a broken leg. So I did that for a while, and it was a nice place to work. I made some good friends there, my first real California friends, and I learned a ton about 3D printing. So that was great. And I stayed there for a while, but eventually another job came through. And the thing is that I had to switch because for the most part, if I'm gonna take a job, I want it to be the job that I could learn something from. That is the primary thing that I look for in a job. And I got a job at a place called Maker Place. Maker Place was a community workshop. It was a metal shop, a wood shop. They did 3D printing, they did laser cutting, they did all kinds of things. They taught classes. It was a fantastic place. And there was a tremendously cool community there who wanted to teach you everything that they knew. A couple of people ran businesses out of there, making furniture and stuff like that, but a lot of it was just people working on hobbies. My job there as a shop tech was to learn all of the tools so that I could make sure people were using them safely and so that I could help fix them when they broke down. And they were all old tools, so they all broke down. But it was great because a lot of my job was you see a tool, you figure out how to use it. Some of them are really complicated. You'll take a class or you'll just look it up on YouTube. But I learned how to use plasma cutters and laser cutters and MIG welding and just all kinds of different things. And I got paid for it, so that was great. So this guy, this little horrible man here, is one of the things that I did when I was there. And that was just something that I ended up doing just to make sure I knew how to use all the tools, you know? And I like it a lot because it is a lot of my skill sets all wrapped up together. There's the 3D modeling that the face is made of, the 3D printing that the face is actually built from, the painting that I learned from just high school, the welding and blacksmithing that I learned in Chicago, and also the woodworking that I learned there. But I also used a couple of other tools in making this. So, you know, it's a creepy little guy. Nobody really likes him, but I kind of do. Yeah, so that was that worked out pretty well. Another thing that I did there a lot was the wood lathe. And the wood lathe is a tool for making bowls, for making table legs, baseball bats, drumsticks, all kinds of like little spindly things out of wood. I had learned it in Chicago at the Park District, and I didn't have any real formal training. It's just something that I knew how to do. So I started using it fairly often because it's just kind of fun. And other people there saw me using it, and I started teaching them how to use it. And then I eventually just started teaching a class out of there on the wood lathe. So at that point, I had taught a little bit of jewelry making in the past, and then I started teaching the wood lathe, and then I eventually took over the just shop introduction. So when new people would come in, I would walk them through a lot of the tools. Another thing that I learned there that I really took to was the laser cutter. So that allowed me to just take 2D digital drawings that I made, just great big shapes, and then cut them out of different materials. If you've never seen a laser cutter, it's about the size of an oven, and you just close the lid. It's basically a laser on a robot arm that will just draw whatever the drawing is that you're feeding into it. So I would cut these different shapes out of wood, and I would just glue them together and paint them and, you know, make a couple of little geometric mandalas, stuff like that. And then I ended up having a breakthrough, and this piece here, I brought in, this wooden bowl. I made that on the lathe. I went out and got myself a fairly expensive piece of wood, and I was carving it, and I got a little too excited, and I busted right through the back end of it. So that was unfortunate. I was really upset at first. But then I thought, you know what, I'm not going to throw this out. I spent $60 on this. I'm going to fix this. So I went back and took basically this same kind of pattern. I made a more simplified version, and I laser cut it out of different woods into just a much smaller shape. And I fit it into the hole that I had mistakenly put into this bowl. I covered it in resin, and then I put it back on the lathe and carved it down again. Resin, if you don't know what that is, epoxy resin is a two-part liquid plastic. You just mix the two parts together, it's a liquid, you pour it over a surface, and it dries into a hard plastic. People use it to cover table surfaces, furniture. You could cover boats, make them waterproof. It's a really useful thing. So I ended up making some of those things, and then I ended up making a little bit of jewelry with exactly the same technique. I would cut out different pieces of wood, just based on a drawing I did, put them together, cover them with epoxy resin, because the resin for me was just glue, because these pieces are a little bit too small to really just glue with regular hand glue. And I ended up selling some of them on Etsy. And in fact, a handful of these are also downstairs in the Mesa College Art Gallery. And then that leads me to the work that I've been doing lately. So around the pandemic, Maker Place shut down. It was really tragic for everybody. There were a lot of people who were really sad about that. But around the same time, another facility doing a very similar thing opened up. So a lot of people just went from the one to the other. And I started doing this kind of work here. So this was the first one that I made that I thought really was a good way forward for me. I was doing 3D digital 3D modeling. I was then breaking it up into different color patterns and cutting them out with a laser cutter and putting them back together just with different colors of wood. So I made a handful of images like this. This is another one. For the most part, when I start drawing, I'll use just some kind of stock footage, just somebody who looks interesting in a photograph. I'll start drawing from them. But I'm actually, with all the drawing I've done, I'm actually pretty terrible at catching likenesses. So they never really look like the person that I was originally drawing. So usually about halfway through the process, I get rid of the reference photo, because that was really just to show you where the eyes and nose go, And I just draw what I think it looks like. So this ended up looking a lot like my cousin Cookie, so I named it Cookie. I ended up doing a lot of more figurative work, and a lot of that is just because of a tool switch on the computer. I went from the kind of 3D modeling that you make in Maya, if you're familiar with that, to ZBrush, and I'll explain that more later on. It's just a more organic way of working, and it leads to more organic form. So I ended up doing a lot of figurative work. I like this piece in particular because this pink wood in the background, it's called aromatic cedar, and every time you cut it or sand it, the whole room just fills with kind of like a flowery smell. It's really fantastic. So I ended up doing a similar kind of thing, just with different materials. This one is made of acrylic sheet. And you'll see acrylic sheet all over the place. If you see signs for grocery stores and liquor stores that light up at night and they're bright and red or whatever, that's cut acrylic sheet with a light behind it. So I just went to a place in National City where they were just selling scraps of it. I got smaller pieces, and I put them together exactly the same way, and found some success with this. I ended up showing this in several galleries around the city. And then I started putting the two techniques together, where I would do a little bit of wood, a little bit of acrylic. With this one here, I ended up using just different laser cut patterns that I painted. And this down here was a laser cut wood grain. The laser cutter doesn't just cut. If you turn it down a little bit, it'll just burn into the wood. So I was able to burn a wood grain pattern into wood that didn't have that pattern. All of this work that I've been doing was pretty much done during the pandemic. A lot of people had a terrible time with that. I ended up being like fairly productive during that time. But, you know, it's still a bummer. I made this piece right as Delta came out. My wife and I had just had about 2 weeks of feeling like the pandemic was over. We went to Chicago, saw all our friends and family and everything, and then Delta came back, everything shut down again, and I felt terrible. So I made this. And this is another one that I did fairly recently where I'm just taking a couple of different images and kind of like collaging them together. This piece has always been one of my favorites, and I brought this one in because you could actually pick it up and look at the back and kind of get a better sense of how it works. Most of the time I've been taking these pieces and putting them on plywood just to give it a little bit of additional strength. But in the beginning, when I was first learning how to do this stuff, I didn't. So this is all just resin together. So with this piece in particular, you could pick it up, flip it over, and the back looks almost exactly the same as the front. So with this, I'd like to show you a little bit of how I make this stuff. This is the digital image that I made in ZBrush. And ZBrush is basically a digital sculpting program. They'll give you just a ball of imaginary clay, and you could pull on it and push on it and just layer more clay on it or scoop some of it out and make whatever shapes you want. It really leads you towards organic drawing rather than more mechanical drawing. And I've described that to people a number of times, and a lot of people don't really know what I mean by this, so I grabbed just a video off of YouTube. This is not me doing this. This is just something that you could find online. So this is somebody just working really quickly, and they sped up the tape and everything. So this is how it actually works in the program. And if this seems fun to anybody, because I feel like this is super fun, if this seems fun to anybody, there is a free version. So this is what I ended up making with that same kind of process. And then what I end up doing, and this next part, I'm not sure how well it'll turn up on the screen here. I took a rendering of it, which basically just means, you know, you color it, you put on filters. There's a bunch of like Photoshop filters and stuff that you put onto it to just get the kind of image that you're looking for. And from that, I put it into Illustrator, which is a program that I use primarily just to block this sort of thing out into color shapes. So I don't know if you really can't see that much at all, but what this actually is a very dark black, a lighter gray, an even lighter gray, and then a background gray. So that doesn't come through that well, but what I end up doing with that is I just block this out into large color shapes, and then I separate them out. And then each pile becomes just a kind of wood. This is the cherry, this is the wenge, and this is the rosewood and the walnut up here. And that is what I end up taking to the laser cutter. And this is just a video of a laser cutter working. It's pretty big, about oven sized, and you put the wood inside of the tray, close the lid, and then the laser just runs and cuts through whatever image you brought in. And this video is doing badly. All right, let's just skip that. That's fine.
Maybe start at the beginning. I think it just needs time to load. Maybe go back to the beginning.
All right. So these are big, expensive, and temperamental machines. So I definitely would not recommend getting one of your own, but there are places where you can go and use them. And Makeatori is the place that I end up using as a wood shop. All right, I'm just going to go ahead and skip ahead. So after I cut everything out of wood, I bring it home, I put it on the table, and I basically put it back together like a puzzle. They're just a bunch of like little scraps of wood, and I just kind of arrange them in the way that I want them. And then once they're good, I'll sometimes glue them down, I'll sometimes tape them, but then I just pour resin over the top of it, and the resin seeps in between the cracks of the wood, and it glues them all together. So this is me sanding it down, which is a very time-consuming practice that I really dislike. But I eventually started using a larger machine to do that. I don't know if this will play a little bit better. So this is the industrial sander that they have at Makeatori. This is what allows people to stop working on small pieces and start working on very large pieces, because it would take me a month to sand this down by hand, but I could do this in an hour with a machine like that. And there are a bunch of people at that shop who make huge, huge tables for like conference tables and stuff like that out of enormous slabs of wood. And they make them all using that machine, and they ship them all over the world. So this is the end result of that kind of thing, and this piece is over here if you want to come up and look at it later on. And as much as they're artwork, they're also just pieces of wood. You don't have to be that precious with them. So you could pick them up and hold them and turn them over and see how they're put together if you like. And these are just a handful of detail shots. I always really like that hand in particular. Yeah, so are there any questions so far before I move on from here? All right.
Do you think it adds like value to an artist to be able to like cross mediums?
I do, but I'm also like very much a tools person. So whenever I go to a gallery, I always want to like see how things were made. I hate seeing like the phrase mixed media. If I ever see that, it makes me crazy. I want to know every single thing that went into it, and preferably have a video of how it was built next to it. So I value that. I'm not sure how much that's valued in the art world. Yeah.
Which of these like design techniques did you prefer, or do you prefer?
Well, one of the things that was really good for me, I feel like, was metalworking, because I was able to work really quickly. But I also just thought it was super cool to work with metal and to like have hot metal and just hit it with a hammer. I thought it was cool. So that was great for me. I really enjoyed that. But now I enjoy wood a lot more, just because there's a feeling to wood that I just really appreciate.
Do you try to make the artwork as flawless as possible?
I mean, I do, but at the same time, I also know that like nothing is ever going to be perfect. So I try and make it to the best of my ability, but I'll cut some corners here and there for sure. Yeah.
Are you ever criticized by people within the art community for using like digital techniques and then applying them to?
Never. No, that's not happened at all. I feel like people are really embracing digital art just because everybody can do it. It's something that everybody can get and learn on their own, just in their homes, without having to like go find a shop that will teach you how to do things. Yeah.
So, with the wood, if you like messed up, does that mean you have to start all the way over?
Well, it depends on what you mess up, because I mess up things all the time. One thing that I do is I will make a laser cut of a bunch of different pieces, and then I'll just lose some. They're too small, they fall into the carpet, I never see them again. So then I have to go back to the drawing and just re-laser cut some stuff. So you never really have to start all the way over. Yeah.
What would you say is a good place to get more skills in woodworking or metalworking if you're someone who has like a little bit of skill but not like all that much?
Well, I do believe there's a wood shop here, and I'm pretty sure you could take a class in it and learn a couple of skills. The place that I go to is called Makatory. That place, I love it, but it is quite expensive. They'll teach you everything you want to know. I teach a wood lathe class there. But yeah, it depends on, I suppose, where you live and what your income level is. But I would maybe start here. There's definitely a wood shop here. And you're already here, so that's a plus. Yeah.
So do they also have the metal work there?
At Makatory, they sure do, yeah.
So like they have classes where you can...
Yeah, you could learn MIG welding, TIG welding, gas welding, blacksmithing. You could use a water jet cutter, which is an amazing tool. It'll cut through anything. I saw a water jet cutter cut through an anvil. So you can do a lot.
I just really like how although the pieces are all completely flat and like 2D, like it looks so dimensional. Like,
Thank you, yeah.
pieces with like the different colored wood, like I would have thought you just like painted it, but it's so nice to see like you actually cut it out from other pieces, then piece it all back together into one. Like that's really cool.
Yeah, I appreciate how flat it is as well. I sand it down a lot. And I like it because honestly, I live with most of these things, so I just rub my hand on them all the time. But yeah, all of the pieces I pick the wood for the colors, and none of it is stained, none of it's painted. It's all the natural color of the wood.
What do you tend to do with it after? Like, I understand you keep a couple of them like for personal.
Well, I show them at various galleries. So I have a couple pieces up at Makatory right now because they've got a showroom there. I'm going to put several pieces in the Echoes of Africa show that Denise Rogers is curating. I just had a bunch of pieces in this residency, and actually that's exactly where I was going to go with the presentation. So.
Can I ask one last question?
Yeah, for sure.
You said the classes are really expensive. Can you share how expensive they are?
You know what? Honestly, I do not know how expensive they are. They change their pricing every now and then. Basically, it works on a membership program. So it actually acts the same way as a gym. You pay for the month or you pay for the year, and you pay for classes separately. So if you just want to learn a thing, I've had several people come and they have a home wood shop, but they want to try this tool to see if this is what they would like for their own work. So they'll come and take a class like that. But if you want to go there and work steadily, you have to become a member. Yeah. So that is when I was invited by Dr. Denise Rogers to become part of the Echoes of Africa show. And that is going to use several items from the World Cultures collection here at Mesa College, as well as the artwork of a handful of local artists. And she was kind enough to take us all on a tour of all of the work that they had, and we were able to take photographs and talk to her about some of the pieces. And it's just remarkable how much artwork they've got. So I took a bunch of the photos home and I started doing drawings of them. I knew I wanted to make something from that, but I wasn't really sure. And when I am in that position, I usually just go back to drawing because that's an easy thing that I enjoy. So I just did a handful of sketches of these pieces. I super like this one. This is such a cool piece. Yeah, and then I saw this. This is Kuba Cloth, and I didn't really know it at the time, but I just appreciated the patterning of it. And then the very next piece that I made after visiting this collection was this one. And this ended up being pretty popular. A lot of people really like this one. It's pretty large. The figure here is slightly larger than a person. But what I want to point out is the background patterning, because I basically just took that right from the Kuba cloths and just applied it to the image that I was working on at the time because I thought it was cool. But, you know, I didn't really learn anything about it. I just kind of saw it and took it. That's not great. You know, you really should learn a little bit about the kind of thing that you're using. So the next thing that happened to me was that I got a residency at a place called Art Produce. And a residency is basically just a space and a time that an organization sets aside for you to do research, to to learn new things, learn new skills, build new projects. It's basically a retreat so that you can just work on something without feeling like you're still in the middle of all your daily life things. And it is a pretty great place. They have a gallery, they do classes, they do performances, they have a beautiful garden in back. I ended up sitting outside and reading and just like eating fruits from their trees. And what they gave me was basically a large room. They call it the cooler room, and I think it actually might have been a cooler for a restaurant at some point. And the proposal for the project that I wanted to do was that I would go back to the Kuba Cloth that I had used without really learning anything about, and I would spend some time learning about it, learning about the people who made it, and figuring out what else I could do with this kind of patterning. So I went back to Denise and I talked to her, and she was kind enough to allow me to use several of the pieces from the collection and bring them to Art Produce. And I brought in some of my own work as well, and I figured I would just spend some time looking at the work that I have made, looking at the Kuba work, and figuring some stuff out. So these are a handful of masks and sculptures and some Kuba cloth. All of this stuff comes from the same part of the Congo. Everything in this room, other than the stuff that I made and brought in, come from the Kuba Kingdom. And here's just another shot of that. And one of the nice things about doing something like this is that you end up, they have a bunch of open houses. So people come in and you meet a lot of people from different kinds of art. I met a bunch of different artists. I met a bunch of people who work at museums and stuff like that. I was able to talk about art with people. And when they first came in the first open house, I was like, yeah, I brought all this stuff in. It's from the Kuba people. I don't know anything about it. That's what I'm going to learn here. And then the second time they had an open house, I knew something about it. So I was able to tell them a couple of things. So that was nice. The first week, I mostly just drew, because that's what I tend to do. So I would look at the images that were around, and I would draw some pictures. But then the first and second week, I ended up doing a lot of reading. So this is the Democratic Republic of the Congo here in orange. It's in Central Africa, and just for scale, this is approximately a third the size of the continental United States. So it's a huge, huge territory. I read a bunch of books, a bunch of different articles about the Congo, but this one, King Leopold's Ghost, is what gave me the real background in the country as a whole. And it is a history book, but it reads very much like a horror book. They have a terrible history. So I will just barely touch on it. So the Portuguese arrived fairly early and set up a slave trade, but they really only were able to get into the very edge here. They didn't go into the larger part of the Congo. So they stopped at the edge, they built a port, and they would kidnap and purchase people and then ship them out to Europe, to eventually the Americas, and to the Middle East. In the 1800s, all of the European powers wanted a colonial asset that they could make money off of, somewhere in Africa or in Asia or in the Americas. And King Leopold II of Belgium decided that his space was going to be the Congo. So because no Europeans had gone there before, and he just saw it on a map and was like, this one's for me. So he gathered up a bunch of European kings and said, hey, I would really like to own this land. And they were all like, yeah, there aren't any Europeans here. Take it, it's yours. So he got to be in charge by himself of this entire piece of land, occupied by millions of people, and he just took it over entirely. He hired himself a fairly famous explorer, and he built himself a private army. And he sent them all down there to go down there and extract as much wealth as they could. They started with ivory, because this was a time before plastics. So ivory was just a material that you could carve fairly easily, and you could make all kinds of household things with it. So they sent all these white Europeans down there, and basically their charge was to create a slave state where they used all of the native people to just get ivory and carry it back and forth to the ships and ship it back to Belgium. So Belgium was shipping Europeans and weaponry to the Congo, and the Congo was then shipping back ivory. Eventually, somebody figured out a different way of curing rubber. And people started using that for bicycle tires and more so for automobile tires. This was the start of automobiles in the world. And everybody wanted rubber. All of a sudden, it was a big commodity. And Leopold knew that there was a lot of rubber in the Congo. So all of the tragedy that happened in the Congo over the ivory, all of the murder and slavery and everything. Huh.
Click on,
Remind me later?
say skip, and
Skip.
then click on Chrome again.
Okay. Okay, cool. So anyway, everything got much, much worse. This was a very terrible history. I'm not going to go into it a lot, but I am going to tell you that this land, full of millions of people, about a third the size of the United States, lost approximately half of its population because Leopold went in there and he just used machine guns to compel people to work. But fortunately, he was not the only person who went there. This is William Shepherd right here. He's a Protestant minister, comes from Virginia. His parents were slaves. He grew up in the church, and he wanted to teach people about Jesus. He was also an adventuresome guy. He wanted to go to Africa and see what it was like. So he eventually was able to get out there, and he went to the same port that the Portuguese originally got to, and started going up the Congo River. And instead of murdering and extracting wealth, he was talking to people, finding out who they were, what their practices were, what their stories were, what their languages were. He ended up learning a lot of different languages, making friends wherever he went. And he just wanted to explore, talk to people about Jesus, build a couple of missionaries. And he made a ton of friends. He was very, very popular there. And eventually, he ended up hearing about the Kuba kingdom. And the reason he heard about them is because they ended up making a lot of artwork that they would ship out, that they would trade with other tribes. So he started heading in that general direction, thinking that he would get there and meet them and everything. At first, everybody was cool with that. But as he got closer and closer, they started warning him, you know what, these people are very private. You do not want to go and meet them. And he was like, it's okay, I'm just gonna, I have to tell them about Jesus. So it's fine. So he would convince people to take him a little bit further towards them, but no one would take him all the way. So he would go a little bit further, go to the next town, and they would say, no, don't go any further. Just stay in this town with us. Because the Kuba people were in a very, very secluded part of the Congo. They were surrounded by rivers and in a very dense rainforest. So the Belgians never got there. They didn't have any Europeans in there at that time. But Shepherd was persistent, and he got closer and closer. He got towards the Kuba kingdom, and eventually the king found out that there was this European, or this Westerner, who was coming his way. And he sent his son, along with a handful of people with spears, to go and kill this guy. Because they did not want any Europeans. They knew what was happening in other parts of the Congo. They didn't want it happening there. So the king's son went to the nearby village that he was staying at, and they noticed all of a sudden, for a European, he was pretty black. They were not expecting him to be black. He also seemed to be friends with the people who lived in the village, which was very unheard of. And he seemed to know some of their language because he was just interested. He would learn their languages. He would talk to people. So the king's son was really surprised by that. He was like, okay, sit tight right here. I'm going to go talk to my dad about this. And there was a little bit of back and forth, and eventually the king invited him to come and visit the actual kingdom. So Shepherd goes over there, and he meets with the king, this guy right here. And even though he was warned before he got here that they were going to kill him if he showed up, within one day of him being there, the king, sitting on his throne, leaned over to Shepherd and said to him, "You may not know it yet, but you're part of our family." So that's a big change from almost dying. He eventually wrote a book about his time with the Kuba people. He was with the Kuba for about 4 months, and he was in the Congo in general for many years. He was there technically to preach the gospel, and he did that, but what he ended up doing for the most part was building missions and sheltering people who were escaping violence from other parts of the Congo. Most of what we know about the Kuba people comes from his writings. So these are people making Kuba cloth. Kuba cloth is something that is made by an entire family. The kids go to the raffia palms. They pull the threading out from it. They bring it back home. The men end up weaving them into structures, and the women end up weaving the patterns onto those structures. So the thing about the patterns in particular is that they are pretty sparse in color. They're very geometrical, and they're also really asymmetrical. That's kind of unusual. Not a lot of people go for asymmetrical artwork, but they really did. And if you see here in particular, one of the practices that they did when they were making larger things, they would fold part of it up so that they couldn't see what was done before, and that kind of ensures that the rest of it is more asymmetrical. So there's 2 different kinds of Kuba cloth. And these are both from the collection here, by the way, or all 3 of them are. This one is something that is worn as a garment or draped around the house. They didn't have a written language, so a lot of the patterning of it is going to represent the family that's making it, their place within the community. So this is more like the everyday wear. This stuff was made pretty much for trade. So if this guy is going to be kind of like a cotton feeling material, these are going to be more like a towel or like a velvet. There's just a lot more heft to it. It's a more physical thing. And they would trade these with other communities around them. So they didn't have just regular money in the Congo at that point. So most of the Congo was operating on trade. They would trade food, they would trade beads and shells, and the Kuba people found that they were very successful in trading their own artwork. So that was most of their commerce. They also didn't have a written language, so they ended up doing a lot of elaborate. Oh, sorry, I missed this slide. So this is the king, and you can see the Kuba cloth behind him, the Kuba cloth being worn all over the place, and a lot of various beads and shells and stuff like that. This was a sign of wealth. He had a very elaborate costume, and this was not like everyday wear. This is what he would wear for the ceremonies. And the ceremonies were there to tell the people about their history. They would wear these really particular outfits. They would do these very specific dances. And the people in the background would drum and chant or sing and tell the history of the people. These are a couple of the main characters. They have a bunch of different characters, a bunch of different masks representing each character. And these are 2 of the main ones. So these are the 3 main characters in their historical dance. All right, so these names are hard, but this one here is Mukim, or Mushemboim, and he represents Woot, the spirit founder of the Bushong tribe. He also represents the first king of the Kuba people, King Siam. And he also represents an elephant because of this trunk here. This one here is Nagdi Amwash, and this is his sister, but it's also his wife. And they tell the story of how they had to leave the north to go down to the place where the Congo actually is, partially because this guy married his wife, or married his sister, I'm sorry. So that is part of the story. The guy in the middle is called Broom, and he represents the common people, and sometimes they think he represents the original inhabitants of the land that was the Congo before the other two came down. And the dance that they do is a conflict between the three of them. This is the version of Broom that we have here in the collection, in the World Cultures collection. And this is Broom with all of the regalia that he wears during the dance. With all of these masks, you can't see out of them. They're huge and they're made of wood, and you just put them on, and you have to know the dance very well. And it is, it's difficult. This is the version of Mukim, or Mushumboy, that we have in the World Cultures collection. And I was able to take this piece to Art Produce and do some drawings of it. This was obviously a very important piece to them. I started doing a drawing, and I liked doing it, but it was just taking too much time. I figured there was no way I was going to finish that drawing and get to making a new piece. So I just took a photograph of it. So that's cheating a little bit. But I took a photograph, and doing that same process, I took it to Illustrator, broke it up into more simplified colors. With this one, I went like really kind of intricate, all of these tiny little pieces, just because it seems like a lot of their work is just extremely intricate. So I went in that direction. And then I broke this image up into different woods. This one is the walnut, and this one is the canary. And this is kind of how I have to lay it out in order to put it into the laser cutter without just wasting too much wood. So I end up using images like this kind of as a map when I'm putting them back together. So this is how I ended up using the space. Once we had all of the open houses and everybody was kind of gone from it, I sort of transitioned it from more of a museum gallery space into more of a workshop. So these are all the various pieces that I was putting together. I also ended up making the sides of this piece in a pattern that I felt was kind of connected to the Kuba cloth. So this is the piece partially put together. Here's the image that I was working from. These are the pieces of wood that I had everything cut out of, and this is where I'm kind of gluing it all back together. So this is what it looks like in the end, and this piece is down here if you want to come and take a look at it later on. I think it came out pretty well. I'm pretty happy with it. It's a lot more abstract than some of the work that I've been doing, but I think it looks pretty good. And this is what it looks like next to the original. And frankly, I prefer the original. I mean, it's pretty awesome. But I'm still happy with what I made. So that is my presentation. So does anybody have any other questions? Well, thank you.